Welcome to Simplify Science Biology Lecture, Unit 9, Section 1, A Part to Play. Quote from William Shakespeare, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man, in his time, plays many parts." Our learning goals are to differentiate different types of cells and be able to organize the levels of an organism. We already know from previous units that cells are built out of proteins. Proteins are coded for in the DNA, and that many cells can work together to form larger multicellular organisms. In the lab, we looked at the differences between generalists and specialists and saw that both of them can thrive in the world. That there are challenges where generalists are more efficient, but there are other times where specialists are more efficient. So it is incorrect to say that one is better than the other. They are just suited for different kinds of challenges. Different types of cells. As the zygote forms, early cells haven't yet gone through determination. Determination means that certain parts of the DNA are activated dependent on what specialization that cell will have in the organism. Determination is just what it sounds like. It has to be determined which kind of cell this is going to be. These early cells have a name that you've probably heard, stem cells. Stem cells are simply cells that haven't gone through a process called differentiation. In differentiation, the activated parts of the DNA allow the cells to develop specialized features that are specialized to the kind of function that that cell is destined to play. Which parts of the DNA get activated depend on the determination that we just talked about. So a cell has to go through determination to find out what cell it's going to become, and then differentiation is the process of it attaining all those different features. Stem cells are very interesting. They haven't yet adapted to a certain function, which means they are flexible and they could adapt to many functions. In the case of embryos, whenever they're developing, stem cells can and will differentiate into all the different tissue layers that you find in the body. In adults, we have some stem cells that are used for repair systems, to replenish tissues. They can become the kind of cell that we need them to become. Now, just as you hear this, it's probably getting some wheels rolling. This is why there's a focus on much ongoing research, because of all the different flexibility, adaptability, and situations that a stem cell could be useful in. Now, in a complicated organism like ourselves that has bilateral symmetry, our embryonic stem cells can change into one of the three different groups of cells: the mesoderm, endoderm, and ectoderm. Now, those words refer to generally where you find them. The mesoderm is the middle layer, the endoderm is the internal layer, and the ectoderm is the external layer. So in the mesoderm grouping of cells, we cells like cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, tubule cells in kidneys, red blood cells, smooth muscle in the gut. All of those count as different types of mesodermal cells. Endodermal cells, such as lung cells, thyroid cells, and pancreatic cells, and ectodermal cells, such as skin cells, neurons, and pigment cells. I know it might seem strange that neurons, like happen in your brain, are part of the external layer, but think of how they connect to your epidermis and how they connect to your senses. We see that there's a great amount of specialization that occurs among different amount of cells. Remember, all these cells have all the same DNA. It just depends on what process of determination and differentiation they went through. Now, this level of specialization is really interesting. These different sections of the DNA that are activated code for these different kinds of proteins to get these different kinds of shapes. Look how different that neuron cell looks there that's been stained with that fluorescent protein on the left. Or look at the different structures that we see on this slide that's been prepared of the intestinal cell. Or the slide of that cardiac heart muscle cell on the right. Or that electron micrograph that was constructed on that bottom right of a red blood cell, a platelet, and a white blood cell. All of these are body cells. They're somatic cells in a multicellular animal like ourselves. And they all come from the same kind of stem cells. Very different, very different. A good case of having advanced specialization is something called apoptosis. Apoptosis is known as programmed cell death. There's such a high level of specialization that some cells, their purpose is to be destroyed, or it might just be they had a purpose and now it's time that they need to destroy themselves, and they will do so for the greater benefit of the larger multicellular organism. A really interesting time that this happens is that the most efficient way for hands to develop is for the whole thing to develop first as a mitt. Imagine just one solid club-like hand, and then the cells between the fingers die off. They go through apoptosis, and that's what separates the digits. That picture there is the hind limb of a mouse. We can see some of that by some of the webbing that happens in between our fingers. That's the leftover cells where the apoptosis stopped happening. It's interesting that that's a more efficient function than our cells trying to grow and extend out like some kind of stalks. Now, I use this word function. The form of the cell is because of the function it performs, but the cell is able to function because it has the proper form. These two ideas, this process is back and forth, or reciprocal. So that gives us a very easy way to go about this. The answer to every question about form, why does a cell have blank, is simply a restatement of function. Well, because having it gave an evolutionary advantage to be able to blank. Let's look at some questions. Why do skeletal muscles have more mitochondria than the average somatic cell? You can pause to think. Remember the form I discussed. So why do skeletal muscles have more mitochondria than the average somatic cell? Well, because having it gave an evolutionary advantage to be able to produce a lot of energy when it's needed. It's the kind of thing that skeletal muscles do. Let's look at a proficient question. Why do epithelial cells that line the inside of the trachea, inside of our throat, have these cilia structures? Because having it gave an evolutionary advantage to be able to filter out dust and microbes and particles from continuing into our lungs. A mastery question. Why do sponges, these are animals in the phylum Porifera, have a list of different cell types that numbers around only a dozen, where humans, we're in the phylum Chordata, have a list of different cell types and numbers around a couple hundred? Why the discrepancy? Well, sponges live in an environment at the bottom of the ocean that is much more constant than our environment. They have fewer challenges of much narrower types of challenges, and so they need less adaptability. Now, multicellular organisms are interesting because they still have separate, individualized living cells, the same way that single-celled organisms are separate and individualized living cells. But because all these cells work together to make a large organism, their advantage is that each cell can specialize to do one function really well, because the other cells will carry out the rest of the necessary functions. They have a division of labor. It's the same advantage that we see in a city. Cities have been highly effective for societies because individual people become very specialized at a role, relying on different people to serve other functions necessary for everyone to survive. The lone mountain man would need to be able to serve all of the functions by himself, or die. He has to have a wide variety of skills, but never practices one enough to become a master of it. He's an effective hunter. He's effective at constructing the shelter. He's effective at defending. He's effective at gathering food. And he's effective at taking care of his health. All of these things he is effective at, and he can do a lot of different things, and he has a very broad, very interesting skill set. But in the city, we have physicians who are much more advanced and able to take care of illnesses and health-related problems that my mountain man would not be able to do. Now, if my doctor tried to hunt like the mountain man could, he couldn't. You know, if we look at these large-scale farming operations that my city has, right on the periphery, they're able to produce enormous amounts of food very efficiently. My mountain man can't collect food at the rate that a specialized farmer can, but he's able to construct shelters in the way that farmers can't. We have architects in the city, and we have plumbers, and we have professors, and we have police, and we have lawyers, and we have artists. We have a wide variety of specializations, but they are focused in on one thing that they do very well. My mountain man can do many things pretty well. So tissues are a collection of these specialized cells. They work together. Human tissues can basically be divided into epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Epithelial tissues mean that there's some kind of protective layer. It's a lining for something. Connective tissues do just that, connect. They serve as a support structure, protection. Together, groups of tissues serve a larger function referred to as an organ. So lung muscle tissue does the expansion and contraction. The lung connective tissue keeps all these different tissues together in place. The lung epithelial tissue is the lining for the gas exchange, and the lung nervous tissues regulates the rate for breathing. Together, all of those tissues make the organ that we know as a lung. The organ that we see on the right in the frog, not the kind of organ that we see on the left. All these organs working together make an organ system. Each organ system serves some kind of function. For example, the digestive system has many different organs in it that's comprised of many different tissues, comprised of many different cells, but together the digestive system is really good about extracting nutrients and extracting energy and extracting the things that we need from food and then getting rid of the rest. If you put all these organ systems together, working in unison to achieve all their different functions efficiently, we get an organism. Maybe an adorable one like this cat. My cat. Circus. So multiple cells make up a tissue. Multiple tissues make an organ. Multiple organs make an organ system. And then multiple organ systems make an organism. Those are the levels. So we have all these different cell types that combine together with more cells like their types to make the tissues, to make the organ, to make the organ systems, lots of organ systems, organism. Let's do a developing question. Compare, contrast, let's do a Venn diagram here, single-celled versus multi-celled. And of course you're pausing to answer these questions yourself instead of just listening to my answer, correct? Of course, naturally you are. So things we might say just about single-celled organisms. They don't have any specialization. They have relatively stable environments. They're somewhat basic compared to things we would say just from my multicellular organism, that they have specialization, they're adaptable, and they're relatively complex. Together, both of them, they're both made out of cells, they both process energy, they both reproduce, they both adapted from evolution. They do have a lot of things in common. Let's look at a proficient question. So, if the testes are where sperm is produced, but if the testes are where testosterone is produced, which organ system does this organ belong in? Reproductive or endocrine? Well, both. Organs aren't necessarily restricted to being in one organ system. So the testes are part of our reproductive organ system, but they're also part of the endocrine organ system. Here's a mastery question. Give an example of when a single-celled organism may have an advantage over a multi-celled organism. So that organism right there, the elegans, is one of the smallest multicellular organisms, comprised of only about 1,000 cells. Whereas an average human might have 37 trillion cells. We can see a little marker there on how big that elegans is. That line is 150 micrometers. We can see over with the paramecium, we've zoomed in 6 times, and that line is 25 micrometers. So my elegans is larger than that single-celled organism, but not hugely fantastically so. But an example of where the paramecium has an advantage over the elegans is that if it's a relatively stable environment, and if the availability of energy is somewhat low, then the efficiency and how quickly and with such little energy the paramecium can function will be an advantage. The more complex, larger structures of the elegans that requires the additional energy could be problematic if it can't find a niche to survive in using those, and if there's not enough energy to take care of all that.